courtroom plunged into a tense silence, broken only by the harsh metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around the wrists of a woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong. Officer Lance Whitaker smirked as he leaned in close, whispering a vile, prejudiced threat. He was utterly convinced he was putting another nobody in her place. He held the badge, the gun, and what he saw as absolute power in Oakridge County. But what Lance didn't know was that the woman he was illegally detaining and shoving toward the holding cell wasn't a nobody at all. Her name was Nova Sterling, and before long, she was going to be sworn in as his new chief of police. The trap was set. Karma was loading, and Officer Whitaker had just blindly walked into the worst mistake of his miserable life. The Oakridge County courthouse smelled of old floor wax, cheap coffee, and decades of unchallenged authority. To the average citizen, it was an intimidating fortress of local law. But to Nova Sterling, it was just another messy desk waiting to be organized. Nova was 48, a former federal agent, and a 20-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. She had built a formidable career out of hunting down corrupt cops, dismantling good old boy networks, and holding the thin blue line accountable. That was exactly why the mayor of Oakridge, Clayton Reeves, had secretly recruited her. The Oakridge Police Department was drowning in federal civil rights lawsuits, excessive force complaints, and allegations of racial profiling. The outgoing chief had been a glorified figurehead who let his officers run wild. Mayor Reeves wanted a complete teardown and rebuild, and Nova was the bulldozer he had hired to do it. Her official swearing in wasn't scheduled yet. Only the mayor and the city council knew what she looked like. To everyone else in Oakridge, the new chief was just a rumor. Nova decided to take advantage of her anonymity. She called it a secret shopper operation. She wanted to see how the officers of Oakridge behaved when they thought nobody important was watching. She dressed down for the occasion. Faded blue jeans, a plain gray zip-up hoodie, no makeup, and her hair pulled back into a simple, unassuming ponytail. She looked like an average working-class local. She walked into the municipal courtroom of Judge Everett Lang, finding a seat in the back row of the gallery. The docket that morning was full of low-level misdemeanors, traffic violations, and petty theft. It was the perfect environment to observe the rank-and-file officers. For the first stretch, things were mundane, but the atmosphere in the room visibly shifted the moment Officer Lance Whitaker pushed through the heavy wooden double doors. Whitaker was a heavy-set man in his late 30s, walking with an exaggerated swagger that suggested he believed the county lines ended where his shadow fell. His uniform was slightly unkempt. His duty belt weighed down with every tactical accessory imaginable, and he chewed his gum with open-mouthed arrogance. Nova watched him closely. His eyes darted around the room, not with the alertness of a protector, but with the predatory scan of a bully looking for a target. Whitaker marched up to the prosecutor's table, completely ignoring the solemnity of the courtroom. He slapped a file down and laughed loudly at a joke the prosecutor made, interrupting the judge, who was mid-sentence with another defendant. Judge Lang merely sighed, too accustomed to Whitaker's disrespect to reprimand him. Nova pulled a small spiral-bound notepad from her pocket and clicked her pen. She had already seen enough red flags in Whitaker's demeanor to warrant a review of his personnel file, but she was about to see exactly why Oakridge was bleeding money in civil rights settlements. The next case called was a young 19-year-old black college student named Darius. Darius looked terrified. He was wearing a shirt and tie, clutching his paperwork with trembling hands. Officer Whitaker took the stand. According to his testimony, he had pulled Darius over for a broken taillight, but the situation had escalated when Whitaker claimed he smelled marijuana and demanded to search the vehicle. When Darius, knowing his rights, politely asked for a warrant or probable cause, Whitaker dragged him out of the car, threw him against the hood, and arrested him for resisting and delaying an officer. No drugs were ever found. As Whitaker recounted the story, he didn't even try to hide his disdain. He referred to Darius as this kid and his type, using dog whistle language that made Nova's blood boil. Your Honor, the defendant was acting aggressively, flapping his arms around, Whitaker testified, a lazy smirk on his face. In my experience, when they start asking about rights and warrants, they're hiding something. I had to secure the scene for my own safety. Darius's public defender weakly argued that there was no dash cam footage because Whitaker had conveniently forgotten to turn it on, a clear violation of department policy. Judge Lang, looking bored, rubbed his temples. Officer Whitaker, try to remember the camera next time, the judge mumbled. He then turned a harsh glare on Darius. I'll reduce the charge to a public nuisance violation. Pay the $300 fine by the clerk. Darius looked devastated. $300 was a fortune to a college student, all for a crime he didn't commit. Whitaker stepped down from the stand, puffing his chest out like a conquering hero. In the back row, Nova's pen flew across her notepad. Officer L. Whitaker, badge 742, perjury, excessive force, profiling, failure to activate body-worn camera. She was writing a mental termination letter. Unfortunately, the furious scribbling of her pen caught Whitaker's attention. Court went into a brief recess. As people filed out into the hallway to stretch their legs, Nova remained seated reviewing her notes. Heavy boot-clad footsteps echoed down the aisle, stopping right beside her row. You got a lot to write about, lady? A gruff voice demanded. Nova looked up. Officer Whitaker was standing over her, his hand resting casually but intentionally on the butt of his taser. He was looking down at her with a mixture of suspicion and deep-seated contempt. To him, Nova was just a middle-aged black woman in a cheap hoodie sitting in the back of his courtroom. Just taking notes, officer, Nova said calmly. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the authority she actually held. Notes on what? Whitaker demanded, stepping closer and invading her personal space. Are you a reporter? You don't look like a reporter. You look like you don't belong here. This is a public courtroom, Nova replied, keeping her eyes locked on his. Anyone is allowed to sit here, Whitaker scoffed, looking her up and down with blatant disgust. Yeah, well, people who sit in the back and take notes on police officers usually have warrants or they're plotting something. Let me see some ID. Nova knew the law inside and out. In this state, an officer could not demand identification without reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime had been, was being, or was about to be committed. Sitting in a courtroom was not a crime. No, Nova said simply. Whitaker blinked, completely taken aback. He wasn't used to hearing that word, especially not from someone he deemed beneath him. His face immediately flushed red with anger. "Excuse me," he snarled, dropping his voice to a menacing whisper. "I said no," Nova repeated, her tone chillingly polite. "I haven't committed a crime. You have no reasonable suspicion to detain me, which means you have no legal right to demand my identification. Now please step aside." Whitaker was furious. His ego, fragile and propped up entirely by the badge pinned to his chest, was shattering in real time. He looked around. A few people lingering in the courtroom, including the bailiff, were watching. Whitaker couldn't let a citizen, especially a black woman who dared to talk back to him with legal jargon, make him look weak. "Listen to me very carefully," Whitaker hissed, leaning in so close Nova could smell the stale coffee and peppermint gum on his breath. "I am the law in this room. You people come in here thinking you know the law from some internet video and you think you can disrespect me? You're going to hand me your ID right now, or I'm dragging you out of here in irons." Nova slowly stood up. Even though Whitaker was taller, Nova's posture was rigid, authoritative, and utterly fearless. She looked at his name tag, then right into his eyes. "Officer Whitaker," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "I strongly advise you to walk away. You are stepping over a line that you will not be able to walk back from." It was a warning, a lifeline. She was giving him one last chance to do the right thing and back down. Whitaker laughed, a cruel barking sound. "Is that a threat? Are you threatening a police officer?" Before Nova could respond, Whitaker lunged. He grabbed her left arm violently, his heavy fingers digging painfully into her bicep. He yanked her forward, throwing her off balance. "Hey!" Nova yelled, her instinct from years on, the force kicking in. She planted her feet and stiffened her arm, resisting the unlawful physical contact. "Stop resisting!" Whitaker roared at the top of his lungs. A classic, dirty cop tactic to justify the violence that was about to follow. He twisted her arm painfully behind her back, forcing her face first against the heavy oak wood of the gallery benches. The remaining people in the courtroom gasped. The bailiff, an older man named Tom, took a half step forward but froze, too intimidated by Whitaker to intervene. Judge Lang, who had just stepped out of his chambers, watched the scene unfold and did absolutely nothing. Nova didn't fight back. She knew the game. If she threw a punch, she was a civilian assaulting an officer, regardless of his illegal actions. She went limp, forcing him to hold her dead weight. Click, click. The cold steel of the handcuffs locked tightly around her wrists, biting into her skin. Whitaker ratcheted them down an extra notch just to inflict pain. "You have the right to remain silent," Whitaker mocked, roughly yanking her up by her bound arms, causing a sharp pain to shoot through her shoulders. "Though I know your kind has a hard time shutting your mouths." Nova's eyes went completely cold. The anger vanished, replaced by a terrifying clinical focus. Officer Lance Whitaker was done. He didn't know it yet, but his career was effectively bleeding out on the courtroom floor. "You're making a catastrophic mistake, Whitaker," Nova whispered softly as he marched her down the aisle. "Shut up," he snapped, shoving her through the double doors into the public hallway. Dozens of people turned to stare as the burly cop paraded the handcuffed woman toward the holding cells in the basement of the courthouse. Assaulting an officer, resisting arrest, failure to identify. Whitaker listed off cheerfully as they walked. "You're looking at felonies, lady. You're going to sit in a concrete box until you learn some respect." They reached the basement holding area. Whitaker shoved her into a small, grimy cell with a barred door. He slammed the gate shut, the metallic clang echoing loudly through the corridor. "Sit tight, sweetheart," Whitaker sneered, tapping his nightstick against the bars. "I'll run your fingerprints later. Let's see how many warrants you're hiding." He turned and walked away, whistling a tune. Nova stood in the center of the cell, her hands cuffed behind her back. She wasn't scared. She wasn't panicking. She looked up at the security camera mounted in the corner of the holding area. "Enjoy your time off, Officer Whitaker," she murmured to the empty room. "Because when I start, I am going to end you." The holding cell in the basement of the Oakridge County courthouse was a miserable, windowless concrete box that smelled of bleach and dried urine. Nova's shoulders ached from the severe angle of the handcuffs, her wrists raw and bruised from where the metal dug into her skin. But she didn't call out. She didn't complain. She simply sat on the cold steel bench, her mind operating like a high-speed processor, meticulously cataloging every civil rights violation Officer Lance Whitaker had committed. Unlawful detainment, false arrest, excessive use of force, battery, denial of due process. The list was long enough to warrant federal intervention, let alone immediate termination. Nova knew that corrupt officers like Whitaker thrived in the dark. They relied on the fear, poverty, and ignorance of their victims to avoid accountability. They expected compliance through terror. What Whitaker didn't expect was a victim who knew the legal code better than the district attorney. Hours of illegal confinement passed before the heavy metal door at the end of the corridor groaned open. Whitaker strutted down the hall, flanked by an older, exhausted-looking desk sergeant named Malcolm Thorpe. "All right, loudmouth, up," Whitaker barked, unlocking the cell door. He grabbed her by the arm again, dragging her out. "Time to process you. Let's see who you really are." They marched her down a short flight of stairs to the precinct's main booking area. It was a fluorescent-lit room bustling with a few patrol officers writing reports and clerks filing paperwork. Whitaker shoved Nova toward the booking desk. Sergeant Thorpe sighed, booting up the automated fingerprint identification system terminal. "Name?" Sergeant Thorpe asked, his voice monotone, clearly numb to Whitaker's aggressive antics. Nova looked at him. "I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, and I am formally requesting my phone call." Whitaker slammed his hand on the desk, startling the nearby clerks. "You don't get a call until you're booked, and you don't get booked until you tell us who you are." "Actually, officer," Nova replied, her voice eerily calm, "state law mandates that a detainee be granted a phone call within a reasonable time after being brought to a police facility, regardless of the completion of booking. I have been in a cell for hours. I want my call." Thorpe frowned, looking nervously at Whitaker. She was right. "Lance just lets run her prints. We can bypass the verbal if she won't talk," Whitaker sneered. "Fine. Roll her fingers. Let's see the rap sheet." He unlocked Nova's cuffs only to immediately forcefully grab her right hand, jamming her fingers one by one onto the glowing green glass of the digital scanner. Nova didn't resist, keeping her face completely impassive. Sergeant Thorpe hit the submit key. "All right, running it through the state database and NCIC." The three of them stood in silence as the progress bar on the screen crawled forward. Whitaker crossed his arms. A smug, triumphant smile plastered on his face. He was waiting for a laundry list of drug charges, theft, or outstanding warrants. He was waiting for validation. Instead, the computer screen flashed a harsh, solid yellow. A loud, repetitive alarm beeped from the terminal. Sergeant Thorpe leaned forward, squinting at the screen. The color completely drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "What is it?" Whitaker demanded, leaning over the desk. "She got warrants? I bet she's got warrants." "Lance," Thorpe whispered, his hands trembling over the keyboard. This isn't a warrant." "Then what the hell is it?" "It's a DOJ block," Thorpe stammered, looking up at Nova with sudden wide-eyed terror. "It's a level 1 federal restriction. Her file is sealed by the Department of Justice. The screen says, "Do not detain, immediate release required. Notify regional FBI field office." The booking room went dead silent. The 2 other officers typing reports stopped and turned around. Whitaker scoffed, though a tiny fracture of doubt appeared in his eyes. "That's impossible. The machine is broken. Run it again." "I can't run it again, Lance. It locked me out of the terminal." Thorpe panicked, backing away from the computer. He looked at Nova, who was calmly rubbing the circulation back into her bruised wrists. "Ma'am, who are you?" "I asked for my phone call, Sergeant," Nova said, her voice carrying the absolute commanding weight of a predator who had successfully cornered its prey. "Now give me the phone." Thorpe didn't hesitate. He practically shoved the heavy desk phone across the counter toward her. Whitaker stood frozen, his brain struggling to process the monumental shift in power that had just occurred. Nova dialed a number from memory. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't a family member. It was the direct private cell phone line of Oakridge Mayor Clayton Reeves. Miles away, inside the pristine glass walls of City Hall, Mayor Clayton Reeves was in the middle of a tense budget meeting with City Attorney Warren Blake. Reeves was a pragmatic, no-nonsense politician who had staked his entire re-election campaign on cleaning up the city's corrupt police force. When his private phone buzzed, he checked the caller ID. It was an unknown municipal number. Annoyed, he answered it. "Reeves." "Clayton," a calm, professional female voice said. "It's Nova Sterling." Mayor Reeves sat up straight, instantly waving off Blake's presentation. "Nova, where are you?" "We weren't scheduled to meet until later for the final contract signing." "I'm currently standing at the booking desk of the Central Precinct," Nova said, her tone completely devoid of emotion. "I was illegally detained, physically assaulted, and unlawfully arrested in Judge Lang's courtroom hours ago by an officer, Lance Whitaker. I'm currently waiting for someone to process my release." The silence on the line was deafening. Mayor Reeves felt the blood rush to his ears. A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. "You're where?" the mayor choked out. "Central Precinct booking. Officer Whitaker is standing about 3 feet away from me." "I suggest you get down here, Clayton. The secret shopper phase of my contract is over. It's time to start the demolition." The line clicked dead. Mayor Reeves slammed the phone down and bolted out of his chair. "Warren, get your coat right now." "What? Clayton, what's going on?" the city attorney asked, scrambling to gather his files. "One of our idiot cops just arrested the incoming chief of police," Reeves roared, sprinting toward his office door. "And he physically assaulted her." Blake dropped his briefcase. "Oh my God, the DOJ is going to crucify us." "Only if we don't crucify Whitaker first. Move." Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was suffocating. Whitaker was pacing back and forth, trying to convince himself that there had been a computer glitch. He pointed a thick finger at Nova. "You're running some kind of scam," Whitaker sneered, though his voice lacked its previous thunder. "You stole someone's identity, that's it. You're a federal identity thief." Nova simply watched him. She didn't say a word. Let him dig the hole deeper. Minutes later, the heavy double doors of the precinct lobby violently crashed open. Mayor Clayton Reeves stormed into the room, his face a mask of absolute, unbridled fury. Right behind him was City Attorney Warren Blake, looking pale and out of breath. The desk officers immediately jumped to their feet. Whitaker, oblivious to the reality of the situation, saw the mayor and smiled. He puffed out his chest, stepping forward to greet him. "Mayor Reeves, good to see you, sir. If you're here about the budget, I can tell you were hard at work. Just took another aggressive criminal off the streets." "Shut your mouth, Whitaker," Mayor Reeves bellowed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. The sheer volume and rage in the mayor's voice stopped Whitaker dead in his tracks. Reeves completely ignored the bewildered officer and power-walked straight to the booking desk. He stopped in front of Nova. He looked at her bruised wrists, her disheveled hoodie, and the red marks on her arms. The mayor of Oakridge County took a deep breath and in front of a half-dozen stunned police officers bowed his head slightly. "Miss Sterling," Mayor Reeves said, his voice trembling with a mixture of immense respect and profound embarrassment. "I cannot express how deeply, deeply sorry I am for this. Are you injured?" Nova lowered her arms. "I'll survive, Mr. Mayor, though my wrists might need some ice." Whitaker's brain short-circuited. He looked from the mayor to the woman in the faded hoodie, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Mayor, sir," Whitaker stammered, stepping forward. "I don't understand. Do you know this woman? She was resisting. She wouldn't show ID. She's a nobody." City Attorney Blake stepped out from behind the mayor, glaring daggers at the officer. "Officer Whitaker, you colossal imbecile. You didn't arrest a nobody." Mayor Reeves slowly turned around to face Whitaker. The look in his eyes was lethal. "Lance," the mayor said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch, "allow me to introduce you to Nova Sterling, former federal agent, 20-year veteran of internal affairs, and as of her start, she is your new chief of police." The atmosphere in the central precinct booking room didn't just change, it curdled. The air, already thick with the smell of floor cleaner and old paperwork, seemed to vibrate with the sudden violent shift in the power dynamic. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the overhead fluorescent lights and the ragged, shallow breathing of Lance Whitaker. The color had drained from his face so completely that his skin took on a sickly, translucent gray hue. His eyes, once bulging with predatory excitement, were now wide and frantic, darting between Mayor Reeves, the grim-faced city attorney, and the woman who had just moments ago been his nobody victim. Whitaker let out a weak, sputtering laugh, a sound born of pure, unadulterated panic. "Sir, Mayor Reeves, this is a misunderstanding, a huge one. This woman, she was acting suspicious. She was in Judge Lang's court writing things down, refusing to show ID. I was just following protocol. I was protecting the court." "Protocol?" Mayor Reeves's voice didn't just boom. It shook the glass partitions of the booking desk. He stepped into Whitaker's personal space, his face a mask of absolute, unbridled fury. "You think dragging a citizen into a cell because she dared to know her rights is protocol? You think assaulting a woman in a house of law is protecting the court? She was resisting, Whitaker cried out, his voice cracking. He looked toward Sergeant Malcolm Thorpe, pleading for backup. Sarge, tell him she wouldn't identify. I had to secure her. Sergeant Thorpe, a man who had spent years keeping his head down to reach his pension, looked at Whitaker with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. He slowly backed away from the desk, putting distance between himself and the man who had just set the department on fire. Lance, Thorpe said quietly, his voice heavy with the realization of what was coming. Just stop talking for your own sake. Shut up. Nova Sterling stepped forward. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her presence was a physical weight in the room, a gravity that pulled everyone's attention toward her. She raised her arms, showing the raw red welts where the handcuffs had been ratcheted down past the point of safety. Officer Whitaker, Nova said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made the hair on the back of the other officers' necks stand up. You have committed 4 separate felonies and at least half a dozen civil rights violations. You didn't arrest me because I was a threat. You arrested me because I didn't bow to your ego. You saw a black woman in a hoodie, and you assumed I was powerless. You assumed I was uneducated. You assumed no one would care if you broke her. She took a step closer, her eyes locking onto his with the intensity of a laser. You were wrong on every count. Whitaker stumbled back, his heel catching on the leg of a chair. I didn't know who you were. If I'd known you were the new chief. That's the point, Lance, Mayor Reeves roared. The law doesn't change based on who you're talking to. You treat the homeless man on the street with the same constitutional respect you'd treat the president. That is the job. A job you clearly have no business holding. City Attorney Warren Blake stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. He looked like a man who was already calculating the multi-million-dollar settlement the city was going to have to pay. Chief Sterling, your contract was set to begin soon. However, given the systemic failure of leadership we are currently witnessing, the mayor and I are prepared to authorize an emergency activation of your command right here, right now. The other officers in the room, 2 patrolmen who had been filing reports and a clerk at the computer, all stood up. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The outsider they had heard rumors about wasn't coming in a suit with a press release. She was already here and she had seen the worst of them. Seen the Nova Sterling, the mayor said, his voice regaining its formal ceremonial weight. Do you wish to take the oath now? Nova didn't hesitate. She stood straight, her shoulders square, ignoring the ache in her arms. She raised her right hand. The room fell into a deathly silence. I, Nova Sterling, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of this state. As she spoke the words, Whitaker seemed to shrink. He looked down at his own uniform, at the badge she had worn like a weapon for years. Every word Nova uttered was a nail in the coffin of his career. She wasn't just taking a job. She was reclaiming the building from people like him. And that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office of Chief of Police for Oakridge County. So help me God. The silence that followed was heavy. Nova lowered her hand. She turned her gaze to Sergeant Thorpe. Sergeant, she commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the first order of a new era. Yes, Chief, Thorpe replied, snapping to attention. Officer Lance Whitaker is hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately. He is to be placed on administrative suspension pending a full internal affairs investigation and criminal referral to the district attorney. Whitaker gasped, his hands shaking. You can't do this. I have seniority. I have the union. You have nothing, Nova replied coldly. Sergeant, relieve him of his service weapon and his badge. Do it now. The room held its breath. This was the moment of truth. Would the blue wall hold, or would it crumble? Thorpe didn't hesitate. He stepped toward Whitaker. Lance, the belt, give it to me. Sarge, you can't be serious, Whitaker hissed, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. For a split second, his hand hovered near his holster, a reflex born of years of being the most dangerous man in the room. Hand away from the weapon, Lance, Mayor Reeves barked. The tension was a physical cord ready to snap. Nova didn't flinch. She stared Whitaker down, her eyes telling him exactly what would happen if he made one more mistake. Whitaker saw the look. He saw that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the hunter. He was the prey. With trembling fingers, Whitaker unbuckled the heavy leather duty belt. The clatter of the handcuffs, the holster, and the radio hitting the linoleum floor sounded like a thunderclap in the small room. He then reached up, his face contorted in a mask of bitter, impotent rage, and unpinned the silver shield from his chest. He slammed it onto the booking desk. You're making a mistake, Whitaker spat, though his voice was thin and greedy. This town, this department, they won't follow you. You're an outsider. You're a woman. I am your superior officer, Nova interrupted, her voice like grinding stones. And right now you are a civilian trespasser in a secure police facility. Sergeant Thorpe, escort Mr. Whitaker to the exit. If he sets foot on department property again without a subpoena, arrest him for trespassing. Thorpe grabbed Whitaker by the shoulder. Not gently, but with the firm grip of a man who was tired of carrying a bully's water. He marched the disgraced officer toward the door. As they passed the booking computer, Whitaker caught a glimpse of the screen. The yellow "Do Not Detain" flag still blinking, a silent witness to the exact moment he had destroyed his own life. Once the door swung shut behind them, Nova turned to the remaining staff. The officers were staring at her, a mixture of awe and terror on their faces. Back to work, Nova said firmly. And get me the file on the young man from the courtroom this morning. Darius, I want his arrest report, the dash cam footage if it exists, and I want the district attorney's office on the line. She looked at Mayor Reeves. Clayton, thank you for coming down. But the work starts now. I need a list of every officer who has worked a shift with Whitaker in recent months. We aren't just cutting out a weed. We're turning over the soil. The internal investigation begins. The following hours were a whirlwind of activity that felt more like a military operation than a change in police leadership. Nova didn't go home to change. She stayed in the precinct, still in her hoodie, working out of a temporary office. While the staff scrambled to meet her demands, she discovered that Whitaker had been a protected officer. His high arrest numbers had made the previous chief look good on paper, leading everyone to ignore the mounting stack of civilian complaints that usually ended up lost in the system. As Nova dug through the digital records, she found a treasure trove of red flags, use of force reports that didn't match medical records, lost body cam footage during critical incidents, and a suspiciously high rate of vehicle forfeitures. She stayed until late into the night, fueled by cold coffee and a burning sense of purpose. She wasn't just looking for evidence against Whitaker anymore. She was mapping the rot. Every time she found a report where another officer had stood by and watched Whitaker abuse a citizen, she marked the name. By the time the sun began to peek over the Oakridge skyline, Nova Sterling had a list. It was a list of names that would be leaving the department. She walked out to the main desk where a fresh shift of officers was coming in. They had all heard the news. The building was silent as she walked through. She stopped at the desk where she had been booked just hours prior. "Sergeant," she said to the new desk officer. "Yes, Chief," the man replied, standing up so fast he nearly knocked his chair over. "This booking area is a disgrace," Nova said, pointing to the grimy walls and the outdated equipment. "Starting soon, we renovate. Not just the building, but the way we treat people who come through that door. If I ever see a citizen treated with anything less than professional courtesy again, the officer responsible will be sitting in the cell they just filled. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Chief." Nova nodded, turned, and walked out of the precinct. As she stepped into the cool morning air, she looked at the courthouse across the street, the building where Lance Whitaker thought he was a god. She took a deep breath, the first one that didn't feel constricted by the weight of the last hours. The secret shopper was gone. The bulldozer had arrived, and Oakridge County would never be the same. The fallout was not merely a local scandal. It was a biblical reckoning that swept across the nation. It started with a leak. True to the reality of the digital age, a young records clerk at the municipal courthouse had recorded the hallway altercation on her smartphone. The footage showed Officer Lance Whitaker violently shoving a calm, compliant, unarmed black woman in a gray hoodie toward the holding cells. Paired with an anonymously leaked audio file from the precinct booking room, capturing the exact moment Mayor Clayton Reeves revealed the woman's true identity, the story became a powder keg. Within days after the incident, the video had hit the front page of every major news aggregator. It exploded on social media, trending nationally. Cable news networks picked it up, running the footage on an endless loop. Pundits dissected Whitaker's aggressive body language, his blatant disregard for the law, and the chilling ease with which he perjured himself against a college student. Whitaker, suspended without pay and confined to his suburban home, watched his entire life disintegrate in real time from his living room sofa. His phone rang incessantly. Reporters, angry citizens, and former colleagues who were hastily trying to distance themselves from his toxic fallout. Even his wife, citing the absolute humiliation and the sudden presence of news vans camped out on their front lawn, packed a suitcase, and took their children to her mother's house in the next state over. He was entirely, profoundly isolated. The badge that had once been his shield was now a massive glowing target on his back. While Whitaker wallowed in self-pity, Chief Nova Sterling was executing a master class in institutional house cleaning. She didn't take a victory lap. She went straight to work. On her first day, officially sworn in and seated behind the massive oak desk in the chief's office, Nova launched the most aggressive internal affairs audit Oakridge had ever seen. She didn't trust the local IA detectives. Knowing they were likely infected by the same blue wall of silence that had protected Whitaker for years. Instead, she brought in an outside consultant, Nolan Drexler, a retired, ruthless federal prosecutor she had worked with during her Chicago days. Together, they pulled every single arrest report, traffic stop log, and evidence voucher with Lance Whitaker's signature on it, spanning the last years. What they found was a horrifying systematic pattern of predation. Whitaker hadn't just been a bully, he was a criminal operating under the color of law. The audit revealed a staggering statistical anomaly. 82% of his traffic stops involved minorities, and nearly all of those resulted in questionable probable cause vehicle searches. But the most damning evidence came from the property room. Nolan Drexler discovered a discrepancy in Whitaker's narcotics and cash seizures. Time and time again, Whitaker would report seizing small amounts of drugs and cash from suspects. But the body cam footage, when he actually bothered to turn it on, often showed suspects carrying significantly more money than what was officially logged into evidence. Whitaker had been skimming off the top for years, stealing from the very people he was falsely arresting, knowing they had no legal recourse to complain without risking longer prison sentences. "He's running a shakedown racket, Nova," Drexler said, dropping a thick 3-ring binder onto her desk late one night. "He targets marginalized folks, seizes their cash under civil asset forfeiture laws, logs half of it, and pockets the rest. This isn't just a fireable offense, it's a federal RICO violation." Nova's eyes hardened as she flipped through the pages. "Flag it all. Send copies directly to the FBI field office in the capital city. I want him decertified, terminated, and indicted before too long." Weeks later, the formal disciplinary board convened in the windowless conference room of the city's administrative building. Lance Whitaker sat at the defense table, looking like a ghost of his former self. He had lost weight. His face was pale and unshaven, and the arrogant smirk that usually defined him had been entirely erased by panic. Beside him sat his union representative, Keith Donovan, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Chief Sterling sat at the head of the long table, flanked by Mayor Reeves and the city attorney. She was in her full Class A uniform, the 4 gold stars on her collar gleaming under the harsh overhead lights. Donovan tried to mount a defense, but it was pathetic. "Chief Sterling, the union maintains that Officer Whitaker made a good faith mistake in a high-stress environment. He believed you were a sovereign citizen attempting to disrupt court proceedings. His use of force, while regrettable in hindsight, was dictated by his training." Nova didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply leaned forward and pressed play on a digital recorder resting on the table. Whitaker's own voice filled the room, recorded from the booking room body cams. "You people come in here. I know your kind has a hard time shutting your mouths." Nova paused the audio. The silence in the room was suffocating. "Mr. Donovan," Nova said coldly, "does the union's training include explicit racial profiling, false imprisonment, battery, and perjury? Because we have dozens of separate cases we are currently overturning where Officer Whitaker used those exact tactics. We have video evidence of him physically assaulting his commanding officer, and we have undeniable financial records showing he has been stealing evidence money to fund a lifestyle far beyond his municipal salary." Donovan closed his file folder, looking down at his hands. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. He didn't say another word. Whitaker, however, broke. "You set me up," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "You came into my courtroom looking for a fight. You ruined my life." "You ruined your own life, Mr. Whitaker," Nova replied, her voice dropping to a deadly clinical tone. "You used a badge to terrorize people who couldn't fight back. You built a career on intimidation, but you made the fatal mistake of intimidating the wrong woman." She stood up, towering over him, metaphorically, if not physically. "The board's decision is unanimous. Lance Whitaker, your employment with the Oakridge Police Department is terminated with cause, effective immediately. Your law enforcement certification in this state is permanently revoked. Your municipal pension is stripped due to felony misconduct. You will never wear a badge again." Whitaker buried his face in his hands, openly weeping. But the true karma had only just begun. The federal raid came days later, right at the break of dawn. Whitaker was asleep in his empty house when the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood violently jolted him awake. "FBI, federal agents, search warrant. Show me your hands." Before Whitaker could even sit up, his bedroom door was kicked open. 3 heavily armed federal agents in tactical gear swarmed the room, aiming blinding flashlights and assault rifles directly at his chest. "Hands! Let me see your hands!" the lead agent roared. Whitaker, terrified and disoriented, threw his hands in the air, begging them not to shoot. He was dragged out of bed in his boxers and a tattered t-shirt, thrown face down onto his own hardwood floor, and roughly handcuffed behind his back. The metal bit painfully into his wrists, a sharp physical echo of the exact pain he had so casually inflicted on Nova Sterling and countless others. They hauled him out of his house and onto his front lawn. The sun was just starting to rise, and his neighbors, people he had always tried to impress with his loud truck and authoritative swagger, were standing on their porches in their bathrobes, watching in stunned silence as the former police officer was perp-walked to a waiting armored SUV. Agents were already hauling boxes of documents, electronics, and a hidden safe out of his garage. Because of the stolen evidence money, the federal government had authorized asset forfeiture. Whitaker watched in despair as a tow truck backed up to his driveway and hooked up his brand new $70,000 pickup truck, seizing it as the proceeds of criminal activity. Everything he had built on the backs of his victims was being systematically dismantled and taken away. In a twist of profound, almost poetic justice, Lance Whitaker's federal arraignment took place in the exact same municipal courthouse where he had operated like a tyrant. However, the environment had drastically changed. Judge Everett Lang, the complacent judge who had allowed Whitaker to run roughshod over the law, was nowhere to be seen. Following Chief Sterling's blistering ethics complaint to the state judicial board, Lang had been given an ultimatum: face a public humiliating misconduct trial or quietly take early retirement. He chose the latter. Replacing him was Judge Silas Hawthorne, a no-nonsense, fiercely intelligent jurist who had absolutely zero tolerance for corrupt law enforcement. Whitaker was led into the courtroom, wearing a bright orange county-issued jumpsuit. His hands and ankles were bound in heavy chains that clinked loudly with every shuffling step he took. The swagger was entirely gone. He looked small, broken, and terrified. He stood before the prosecutor's table, the exact spot where he had stood earlier, laughing and chewing gum while lying about a 19-year-old college student. The federal prosecutor read the charges into the record. It took several minutes. Deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated assault, felony perjury, extortion, wire fraud, civil rights violations. "How do you plead?" Judge Hawthorne asked, glaring down at Whitaker over his spectacles. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Whitaker's public defender mumbled. Whitaker couldn't afford a private lawyer anymore. All his assets were frozen by the feds. "The government requests that the defendant be remanded into custody without bail, Your Honor," the prosecutor stated firmly. Given his intimate knowledge of police procedures, his history of witness intimidation, and the severity of his federal charges, he represents a clear and present danger to the community and a severe flight risk. Judge Hawthorne didn't even hesitate. "I agree. Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in federal custody until trial." Whitaker's knees buckled. A sheriff's deputy had to grab him by the arm to keep him from collapsing. He was going to a federal penitentiary as an ex-cop. It was an absolute death sentence. As the deputies turned him around to lead him back through the heavy wooden double doors toward the holding cells, Whitaker looked up into the gallery. Sitting in the very back row, in the exact same seat she had occupied on that fateful morning, was Chief Nova Sterling. She was wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit, watching the proceedings with a look of calm, unshakable resolve. But she wasn't alone. Sitting right next to her, wearing a sharp new suit and tie, was Darius. The young man's bogus criminal record had been entirely expunged by the district attorney. Furthermore, Nova had personally recommended him for a paid administrative internship at the city attorney's office, effectively launching the young man's career in law. Darius looked at Whitaker, not with fear but with pity. Whitaker felt a cold chill run down his spine as the deputies shoved him forward. The heavy doors swung shut behind him, sealing him in the dark, windowless corridor that led to the holding cells. The clanging of his own chains echoed off the concrete walls, a relentless, mocking reminder of the trap he had blindly walked into. Karma hadn't just knocked on Lance Whitaker's door. It had kicked it off the hinges, served a federal warrant, and locked him away in the dark. The era of the untouchable bully in Oakridge was dead, buried under the unwavering integrity of a chief who knew that true justice didn't wear a badge to intimidate, but to protect and serve. And for the first time in years, the citizens of Oakridge could finally breathe. True justice isn't always swift, but when karma finally arrives, it never misses its mark. Lance Whitaker learned the hard way that the power of the badge is a privilege to serve, not a weapon to oppress. Chief Nova Sterling proved that true leadership means standing up for what's right, even when you're standing alone in the back of a courtroom. It takes immense courage to break a cycle of corruption, but it only takes one person to spark that change. If you loved watching this arrogant bully get the ultimate reality check and seeing true accountability brought back to the system, please hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that karma is real. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible, satisfying stories of justice served. Thanks for watching.